Yesterday, December 25th, 2025 at 5:59 p.m. Eastern Time, President Donald Trump, the sitting president of the United States, made a post on his Truth Social account on Christmas night. While families across the country were gathered together celebrating the Christian holiday marking the birth of Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, on what many consider the holiest day in the Christian faith, the President of the United States announced to the world that the United States military was engaging in yet another undeclared war, and this time in Nigeria, Africa. I want to read his words directly so there's no confusion about what was said or how it was framed. He said in his post, "Tonight, at my direction as the commander-in-chief, the United States launched a powerful and deadly strike against ISIS terrorist scum in northwest Nigeria, who have been targeting and viciously killing primarily innocent Christians at levels not seen for many years and even centuries. I have previously warned these terrorists that if they did not stop slaughtering of Christians, there would be hell to pay, and tonight there was. The Department of War executed numerous perfect strikes, as only the United States is capable of doing. Under my leadership, our country will not allow radical Islamic terrorism to prosper. May God bless our military, and Merry Christmas to all, including the dead terrorists, of which there will be many more if the slaughter of Christians continues." That's his statement. Those are his words. At Bring Our Troops Home, we want to respond clearly, directly, and without any distortion. First, something must be said plainly. The slaughter of Christians in northern Nigeria is real. It's not exaggerated, and it's not imagined. Churches have been burned, villages have been wiped out, and families have been murdered for their faith. And Nigeria consistently ranks among the deadliest places in the world to be a Christian. And that suffering, it deserves attention, it deserves concern, and it deserves honesty. But sympathy for victims does not suspend the Constitution, and moral outrage does not create legal authority. What was announced on Christmas night was not just concern for persecuted Christians. It was the public declaration of U.S. military force in a country where Congress has never debated war and never authorized it. Nigeria is not Iraq. Nigeria is not Afghanistan. It is not a theater the American people have ever debated, authorized, or asked for. Congress has never voted to authorize the use of military force in Nigeria, and the American people have never been asked whether this is a war that we are willing to fight and die for. Yet once again, Americans were informed after the fact that the strikes had already occurred and that more may follow. This was not consent. This was just notification. It was an FYI. There's a dangerous habit in American politics where every foreign atrocity becomes a test of strength. And if you question a military response, you're accused of not caring. And if you ask who authorized it, you're accused of weakness and obstructionism. And that framing is just dishonest. And we can't hold two truths at the same time. Innocent people are being murdered in Nigeria, and the United States cannot continue drifting into undeclared wars by executive decree. Those truths are not in conflict. They are inseparable. Anyone who has worn the uniform knows how this pattern unfolds. We've seen it before. First, there's airstrikes. They're clean, they're remote, and their sold is limited. Then we give them advisors. We send in training missions. We share intelligence. And then a few hundred troops just for force protection, just for coordinating roles. And then it's years or decades. And years of military presence that nobody ever voted on, years of missions that quietly become permanent. And when these missions expand, it's not just the active duty units that get pulled in. It's the National Guard. Guard units get federalized and rotated into operations that have no democratic mandate, no declaration, and no clear end. They become human tripwires. Their presence, it's not symbolic. It just raises the stakes. And if something goes wrong, and it always goes wrong, if a guardsman is attacked or killed or injured, escalation becomes inevitable. It becomes a duty of our country. And we've seen it before. Iraq, Syria, all across Africa. Once that chain starts, it's very hard to stop. Now, here's why this moment matters even more. 1 year and 8 days ago, on December 18th, 2025, Congress finally repealed the 1991 Gulf War authorization of use of military force, 34 years after Congress gave George H.W. Bush a blank check to decide whether or not to go to war against Iraq. Congress finally took it back 34 years later. And on that same day last year, in the same bill, Congress also repealed the 2002 Iraq AUMF. That one only took 23 years to repeal. And that kind of matters because the 2002 AUMF was the authorization specifically written to fight ISIS. It's gone, which means these airstrikes are now being justified under the 2001 AUMF passed after September 11th. And that authorization was meant for Afghanistan. It was meant for the perpetrators of 9/11 and those who harbored them. It was never meant to authorize permanent global war. Yet, nearly a quarter century later, it's being stretched to justify strikes in Nigeria, announced on Christmas night, without any congressional debate. This is the danger of Congress abandoning its authority, even when it's our guy in the White House. At Bring Our Troops Home, our position is clear. We mourn the innocent victims of violence in Nigeria, including Christian communities that have suffered unspeakable atrocities. But we reject the idea that the President of the United States can unilaterally take this country into war, announce it on social media, and call it leadership. If the United States is going to fight a war in Nigeria or anywhere else, the American people deserve an open debate, a clear authorization, defined limits, and a real strategy for peace rather than perpetual involvement. Endless war by executive decree has failed our troops, it's failed our families, it has failed the very people it claims to protect. That's our position, and it's firm, and it's constitutional, and it's not negotiable. All right, up to this point, I've laid out our organization's position. It's been consistent with all the other conflicts in the world, Venezuela, Iran, Israel, Gaza, all of it. We've been consistent. But for just a moment, I want to zoom out because currently, right now, Nigeria is not the only place that this logic applies. The logic that was used to go to war or the logic of our response. And the problem, it's actually bigger than any one president. It's bigger than any one conflict or any one justification. And yesterday's strikes in Nigeria were justified on moral grounds, the persecution of Christians. But moral sympathy is not the same thing as political authority. Defense of Christians is a cause that many Americans instinctively sympathize with. And for a country with deep Christian roots, the impulse to care about fellow Christians being slaughtered, it's real, it's understandable, it's human, and frankly, it's okay. But that instinct, that's not the problem. The problem is what happens when that instinct is treated as an authority. Because once Congress hands over its war-making power, moral outrage becomes elastic. It can be expanded, redirected, and redefined depending on the priorities of the executive branch. And this time, Nigeria is where it starts. The argument goes something like this. Christians are being persecuted. The violence is extreme. The oppressors are terrorists. The United States can't stand by. Action must be taken. Now, some Americans, they'd agree with that. Others, they wouldn't. And that disagreement, that's the point. Because in a republic, disagreement is not a flaw. It's the mechanism by which people decide how far they're willing to go, what they're willing to pay, and what causes justify the ultimate cost. Now, take that one step away from Nigeria. What if the persecution weren't Christians? What if the president argued that the persecution of the Buddhists in Myanmar or in Bangladesh required a U.S. military response? This is still religious persecution. It can still be classified as terrorism. It's still morally serious. It still involves innocent people, but already many Americans would feel less certain because these aren't Christian people. In fact, they're probably not even sure where Myanmar is even located on the map. Some might even say, yeah, we should act. Others would say, no, that's tragic, but it's not our war. And again, that hesitation, that matters because it reveals something important. Moral certainty is not universal, even when human suffering is real. And that's precisely why Congress exists. Now let's remove religion entirely. Let's take it out of the picture because religion always complicates the discussion. What if violence were being used to control access to rare earth minerals? Minerals essential to modern technology, national defense systems, energy storage, and manufacturing. The language shifts a little bit. I think I could argue that. Now, it's not persecution. Now it's supply chains. It's strategic vulnerability. It's national security. Some Americans might say, absolutely, yes, this matters. Others would say, no, that's not worth American lives. Again, disagreement. That's the way it's supposed to work. A republic is supposed to resolve that disagreement through our representation. Now, let's stretch our example to absurdity to make the argument uncomfortable on purpose. Let's talk about cocoa. Yes, the base ingredient in chocolate. Let's talk about our indulgence. Côte d'Ivoire, which is also known as the Ivory Coast, is the world's largest cocoa producer. Cocoa is not just a commodity, it's a massive global market tied to food supply chains, consumer goods, trade, economic stability. And here's where this stops being hypothetical or even absurd anymore. The United States is already deeply involved in Côte d'Ivoire. Not militarily at first, economically and politically. American dollars flow through USAID programs, trade agreements, and commercial partnerships. They expand, infrastructure and development projects grow, agricultural initiatives support cocoa and cashew production. Financial institutions invest their money, private American companies enter the market. And at the same time, security cooperations increase. Border security funding, port security programs, counterterrorism assistance, civil affairs teams, joint military exercises, special operations training, and all of it's framed as partnership, stability, development, mutual benefit. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I actually encourage you to read this State Department fact sheet. It was a press release they put out last year. I think you're going to find that I'm not overstating this at all. If anything, I'm understating the scale of U.S. economic influence and Department of Defense involvement. And for the sake of brevity, I'm going to leave it for you to read. Check it out, the links above. Often all these intentions, they are sincere. I mean, the Ivory Coast is obviously critical to United States national security. But here's the pattern again. See if you can recognize it. First, American money flows into the Ivory Coast. American interests form second. American security commitments follow. And once those interests exist, they must be protected. And this is how a tripwire is created, not because anybody planned a war, but because investments demand protection. Partnership demands stability, and instability demands a response. Now imagine violence breaks out in the cocoa-producing regions of the Ivory Coast. Supply is disrupted, markets are threatened, American companies are exposed, regional instability increases. And at this point, the groundwork, it's already there. Now let me introduce the mechanism that turns this into war. And before I go on, this next example is completely fabricated to illustrate a pattern. Any resemblance to real organizations is unintentional and should not be construed as an accusation or attack. I hope that's clear. Now, imagine a lobbying organization forms in Washington, D.C. Let's call it the American Cocoa Industry Public Affairs Committee, ACIPAC. It's a well-funded U.S.-based organization representing cocoa producers, exporters, processors, investors, and related industries to the cocoa industry. It pulls together donors, trade groups, advocacy networks, and political supporters. It hosts conferences. It shapes messaging. It supports candidates. It lobbies for policies that protect cocoa markets and supply chains. Nothing illegal about that. This is just how Washington works. Now imagine a sympathetic commander-in-chief, a president backed by donors and constituents tied to these interests. A president who believes instability must be confronted, who believes American interests should be defended forcefully, who has the political flexibility to label violence against cocoa production as terrorism. At that point, the language changes. Cocoa producers are no longer just farmers, they're partners. Their safety becomes stability, and stability becomes security, and security becomes a national defense interest. And if Congress has already surrendered its authority under a vague, decades-old terrorism authorization, the leap from partner to protected interest happens seamlessly, quietly, on a holiday, while most Americans are sipping their hot cocoa in front of the Yule log on Christmas night. No debate, no vote, no accountability, just a statement after the fact. I have ordered our great and powerful military to respond to the terrorists persecuting the very fine cocoa producers that American families depend on. Just an FYI. just letting Americans know that their cocoa cravings are being defended at the end of a barrel of a gun. The strikes have begun and more will follow, and suddenly Iowa and Nebraska sons and daughters are sent to fight and die on the Ivory Coast to protect a strategic relationship, a vital market, a shared interest, and to defeat what we are now calling the cocoa terrorists. Now, here's the key point. Maybe someday the American people really would decide that defending Christians in Nigeria is worth a war. Maybe someday they would decide defending Buddhists in Myanmar is worth a war. Maybe someday they would decide that rare earth minerals are worth war. And maybe someday they would even decide that the cocoa markets are worth war. I'm not naive enough to pretend that national priorities don't shift over time. In fact, change is the point. But in a republic, those decisions belong to the people, to us. And the way the people speak is through their representation in Congress. If Americans believe a cause is worth blood and treasure, they should elect representatives who reflect that belief and are willing to vote to declare such intentions. That vote matters because it forces debate. It forces clarity. It forces accountability. And it forces the nation to own the cost before the first strike, not after it. What will never support the long-term success or the legitimacy of a republic is giving that authority to a single person in the executive branch. One person deciding when we go to war, where we go to war, for how long, and what cost, and how many Americans are going to die in pursuit of those interests. That concentration of power, that's not strength. That's fragility. And it's exactly what the Constitution was designed to prevent. That's why Nigeria matters. That's why my example of cocoa terrorism on the Ivory Coast matters. And that's why moral outrage, economic interest, and security language must never replace constitutional process. That's why Congress must decide when America goes to war. All right, thanks for joining us on this new episode of Bring Our Troops Home podcast. If you found the conversation valuable, please like it, share it, leave a comment. These discussions matter, and they only reach more people when you help push them forward. To support our work, visit bringourtroopshome.us/donate. And if you believe Congress, not one person, should decide when the National Guard is sent into combat, go to defendtheguard.us, sign the petition, and tell your state legislators that you support the Defend the Guard legislation. Because your sons and daughters should not be sent to fight cocoa terrorism wars or any war unless Congress has declared it. See you on the next episode.